Hi everyone, and welcome to our 12th presentation, video presentation for our English 2170 Introduction to Film class. This one's on the superhero movie. The best general definition of superheroes that I know of is Pete Coogan's definition, which has several parts. 1. A heroic character with a selfless pro-social mission. 2. The same heroic character with superpowers, some kind of extraordinary ability or highly developed physical, mental, or mystical skills that they use to fight crime. 3. A heroic character is a superhero identity embodied in an iconic costume, an iconic appearance, which expresses the character's biography, character, powers, or origin. And fourth, the superheroes having a secret identity that they guard lest their villains strike out against the people they love in their civilian life. It's possible to read superheroes, however, in a connotative way as metaphors that go beyond the surface attributes that Coogan talks about. So Superman, for example, who is jettisoned from a dying planet and arrives in the United States, is usually seen as the ultimate assimilated immigrant. He is adopted by a flyover couple, the Kents, and grows up so closely aligned with the values of the United States that he comes to fight for truth, justice, and the American way. In a more sort of cynical take in Watchmen, Dr. Manhattan is someone who acquires godlike powers in an accident and eventually becomes God. He detaches himself from humanity and he leaves humanity for Mars, completely sort of removing himself from and elevating himself above the race that he was part of when he was still human. Probably the earliest cultural critic to read superheroes in these connotative ways was Dr. Frederick Wertham, a psychoanalyst who worked in New York City and who was a liberal social reformer. He was the only person, for example, to run a mental health clinic for African Americans at a time of deep segregation in the United States culture. And he also advocated regulation of popular culture so that it wouldn't pervert young child's minds. And he saw the superhero as being kind of a negative force, a negative influence on the kids who read superhero comics and who saw B-movie serials about superheroes in the 1940s and 1950s. We can understand Wertham's motivation if we realize that he was born in Germany. And even though he worked most of his adult career in the United States, he was disturbed by what happened to his home country and saw Nazism as one attempt of one group or quote unquote race to elevate itself above the rest of humanity. And thus, the emphasis of super and superheroes seemed to him to be born out of this sort of impulse to rank human beings rather than try to create a society of equality. As to quote Wertham's book Seduction of the Innocent, why does our civilization give to the child not its best but its worst in paper and language and art and ideas? What is the social meaning of these supermen, superwomen, superlovers, superboys, supergirls, super ducks, super mice, super magicians, super safecrackers? Wertham did not see social value in them. One specific reason for Wertham's condemnation of the superheroes is that they were poor role models, that they were motivated to become superheroes not because of altruism, but because of trauma. Batman becomes Batman because his parents are gunned down in Crime Alley. Spider-Man becomes a crime fighter because he doesn't have, when he has the opportunity, to stop the assassin that will later kill his Uncle Ben. All these heroes are traumatized, and thus they're poor role models because they're still dealing with the psychic scars of losing a parent or father figure. I think there's two different ways to read this. One is that you can see superheroes as kind of like being driven by trauma, and you can see that in some of the pathologies of, let's say, for example, dark versions of Batman. But you can also argue that these heroes are heroes precisely because they rise above their trauma in order to do good. But father issues remain one of the key kind of dynamics in the superhero genre, as we can see in Thor Ragnarok, with Thor discovering that his father, in many ways, lied to him about the history of Asgard. Another reason why Wertham wasn't particularly fond of superheroes is that he found them to be vigilante thugs. With superheroes, many of them, might makes right, and they operate outside the law. They function as judge, jury, and executioner, and they mete out punishments without the use of court, without the use of civil rights, without Miranda protections, etc. Probably the ultimate example of that would be the Punisher, who serves again as judge, jury, and executioner for the people that he guns down that he has judged to be somehow morally suspect. Wolverine here, seen sort of eviscerating Bullseye, is another good example of someone who operates outside the law. And again, this is just a little bit too close to kind of Nazism's disregard for the law for Wertham's tastes. And again, it presumes that these super beings have the right to be above the law and mete out whatever punishment they want to, which goes contrary to the idea of building a civilization. As Wertham writes, how did Nietzsche get into the nursery? I think any reading of superheroes has to take into account that there are different versions of each superhero. Superheroes occupy this kind of strange area between being corporate copyrights and being two-dimensional characters. So when we talk about Batman, for example, we can talk about Batman having certain attributes, a costume that varies from different versions of Batman but remains fairly consistent, or the fact that he continually is Bruce Wayne, etc., etc. But on the other hand, versions of Batman are tailored, particularly in film and television, for different demographics. So the 1960s Batman was designed as sort of like a kids show with a winking camp quality for adults, while the Christopher Nolan Batman movies are designed to give us the Dark Knight, who is much more serious and has no trace of camp at all. So when I say superheroes are empty, I mean that they're signifiers that are constantly moved around by corporations and manipulated by corporations and reshaped by corporations, rebooted by corporations in order to appeal to different demographics. What are the differences between Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire, and all the different Spider-Men that we've seen? There are differences, and they're aimed at different audiences. And superheroes are kind of these elastic properties that lend themselves this kind of flexible quality. Here's just a few more examples of different versions of contemporary Batman, whether it be Joel Schumacher's somewhat campy nipple Batman, played by George Clooney, or the fairly faithful but not too dark version of Batman in the animated series, and even the sort of jokingly, cynical and desolate Batman in the Lego Batman movie. Because superheroes can be remade so easily, they've been incredibly useful for being at the center of the new Hollywood blockbuster. Also central is that the superhero battles and exhibitions of superhero power lend themselves to the special effect spectacle that is expected when audiences go to see new Hollywood blockbusters. So a good example of that would be Thor Ragnarok. I remember sitting in the theater and watching that beginning with Thor fighting Surtur, with Immigrant Song by Led Zeppelin playing on the soundtrack, and thinking that was really cool. And that kind of spectacle of a giant fire-breathing demon is exciting to watch, as it is at the end of the film when Surtur destroys Asgard in the Rainbow Bridge. That's kind of what we watch those blockbusters for, is that kind of exhibition of amazing special effects. Because it's easy to reshape superheroes as signifiers, you also have the multimedia marketplace marketing all kinds of products for all kinds of different ages and groups around the figure of the superhero. So, the kids can buy toys, collectors can get Funkos, and, you can even buy art books that feature the art of Spider-Man artists like Steve Ditko and John Romita from Marvel Comics for over $100. Different demographics, all of which focus on our affection for Spider-Man, the shifting signifier. Another way in which the superhero fits into 21st century media trends has to do with convergence culture, the belief by many critics that what is happening is that the differences between film and television are beginning to erode. Some of those differences started to erode in the late 1990s when television shows suddenly grew up and became more artistically ambitious than they'd previously been. They started to have beginning, middles, and endings, including season finales that carried some weight in giving meaning to the rest of the series. They started to have auteurs, directors, producers that had a vision that they would keep consistent across the entire series. They started to experiment with self-conscious and profound storytelling strategies, and they started to explore the possibilities between taking one episode and connecting it into an arc and a season and the entire series, and thinking about those relationships in order to create an organic whole, not unlike the organic whole that movies had created for previous generations. There's various reasons why complex TV emerged in the 21st century. Part of it is the industry started to narrowcast to quality audiences. In other words, it was not so important to get a ton of people watching your TV show as it was to get the right people. And since superhero narratives appeal to young people with a fair amount of discretionary income, they proved to be very popular on TV. Making them more complex was an extension of technology. The idea behind TV these days is that a good TV show is eminently rewatchable, either on DVD or streaming video, because it allows you to see stuff that you missed the first time around. Themes, motifs, ideas that link it all together into an organic whole. And that certainly justifies spending money on DVDs, let's say, for example, and analyzing those TV shows. An audience presumes a media-savvy online participatory culture, a fandom which follows it. Okay, and superheroes have had fandoms since the beginning of the medium. Since the beginning of comics, there have been superhero fans who read them, who create continuities out of them, and who respond when creators build a kind of world for their superheroes to inhabit. So you can see how rabid, let's say, for example, in the late 1990s, the fandom was about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, one of the first complex TV shows. And then you can see the fandoms that evolved to lesser or greater degree around Marvel TV shows like the 3 seasons of Daredevil pictured here. We can maybe see convergence culture's most telling symptom. Nah, that's not the right word. It's not symptom because it's not a bad thing. A most telling example with the Marvel movies, which frankly are just basically TV shows that come out less often than other TV shows that show exclusively on television, but which give us the next Marvel episode when we go to see them. Seeing Avengers Endgame was an interesting experience for me because I think that movie would be incoherent for someone who hadn't seen Marvel movies before. And that's not the point. You're preaching to the fandom who has been on the ride for 20 plus films and waited for the war with Thanos to reach a climax. So what we have is a kind of serialization of TV shows where we wait for the new Marvel episode to first open at the movie theater and then eventually make it into our television sets. And that's not bad. That's not a bad thing, but it shows that these ideas of episodes that will continue indefinitely into the future is not just something that defines TV anymore. It also defines our most popular blockbusters. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk about some of these issues in class.